It's said to rain anytime.
So it's not just COVID who changed things, the weather's also changing.
Definitely. Yes, we are good to go, Peter. We are good to go.
Cool.
Yeah, we are live.
Just, gentlemen, I just want to be able to share quickly my screen with you, and then we can get going. Just, sorry, can you guys just quickly want to get to the first slide, not the last one? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah.
Just put it on a big screen. Better that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. So just some background for the people who don't know me. My original training is as an exercise physiologist or a biokineticist, and obviously worked with the Bulls for 11 years and has been with the Sharks for 9 years. So my primary job at the Sharks is running the Sharks Academy facility, and then obviously help with the performance setup.
Okay.
So obviously one of our biggest issues currently, and I think you guys had it.
Yes.
Sorry, can you guys still see? It's gone black. Okay, there we're back. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Sorry, man. I don't know what happened there with my screen. I had a black screen for a few seconds. So one of our biggest concerns, obviously after COVID, was returning and making sure that firstly our staff and our players and everyone is all right. So I just want to quickly go to the next slide. Sorry, gentlemen, there's something just going on with this computer of mine. Okay, cool. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Just want to minimize this. Okay, let's go back. So I have considering training, supporting the primary needs of our athletes was one of our biggest issues. And that included obviously helping athletes get back to regular schedules. That was a big concern of ours. And especially their normal habits that they had before this lockdown. Obviously, that was in South Africa, it was such a long period of time that they created new habits. So we needed to find a structure to make sure that they stay in habit. So during the COVID times, you obviously send them in their own normal schedule of training. But, athletes, they normally don't abide to the normal. But we needed to get back to normal as soon as we can because we knew that there was games coming up. And one of them obviously being commuting, their academic responsibilities if they were studying, and then basic needs like what time do you wake up? What time do you go to sleep? What was your normal habits and how could we change your normal habits to get back to normal as soon as we can? And then obviously for all of us, most coaching athletes, we've never experienced something like this COVID. It was such uncertain times and uncertain places in our season. We were actually before this in a primary competition in the Super Rugby, and everything abruptly stopped. We were actually #1 on the league, so we were very adamant that we were going to have a great season, and then obviously everything changed. So the upcoming season was something new to us. We were still expected to train so that we can return to Super Rugby. But as you probably saw, then Australia, New Zealand, because it was a lockdown in South Africa, you couldn't get out of the country. They had their own internal competitions, that Utura competitions that they called it in Australia and New Zealand. And obviously they had their own internal competitions. And like you probably saw in the news, from next year onwards, South Africa won't be part of the Super Rugby. So that for us was a big challenge that our athletes and us needed to go through. So with that said, obviously the role of the strength conditioning coach changed. So you can see that's not me, you can see the picture, but we've kindly become not just a strength coach, I've become a cleaner. So most of the times in the gym, every morning is a cleanup. We've got a full-time staff member, and I'll talk a little about later, that's in here that just cleans the equipment. And we change our schedule with our athletes to suit cleaning. You can't believe it's chemicals, masks being worn, and new protocols that we needed to set up, obviously, to keep our athletes and our staff safe. And and that was a big concern because obviously in South Africa, the testing for COVID is quite expensive. So to test them every day is expensive. So we needed to find ways that we can maybe just only test them once a week or twice a week. And the rest of the time, make sure that we follow the basic protocols and rules to keep our athletes and to keep our staff safe. And I think with that said, there came new stresses and new uncertain environments that created challenges for us. One of them obviously being, and I think you've experienced it in your countries, is what do we do with the athlete as they arrive at the stadium? What protocols do they need to go through? And we created an app, I don't know, the Sharks created an app on our phones that you first needed to be able, before you enter in the stadium, there was certain applications and COVID questions that we needed to ask before. Then we obviously monitored temperature for the athletes, and we really regulated to make sure that they are in the protocol, that they were writing down their names and contacts that they had. So trying to keep the risk of, and all of that, the reason I'm telling you this, just created more stress. It created more anxiety. And you can imagine an athlete in an anxious environment is not the greatest athletes to train. But the perspective of it is that everything changed. Our training setup changed, our gym setup changed, and that created uncertainty and it created a lot of stress. So I don't know if you guys could abide and maybe want to at the end talk about it, but it is something new and it's obviously something we needed to think about. Just on that said, even before we started with lockdown, we started coming back. We had increments of coming back and certain staff came back. So there was a sitting staff, about 10 staff members that was included in that came back earlier than the players to set up protocols. And a big issue there was obviously our medical department needed to step in, and our doctor. We had a biokinesis full-time setting up protocols and making sure that we follow the certain rules and guidelines through obviously our government and obviously through SANZAR and IRB. So just some of the challenges that arose from obviously COVID. Obviously we needed to modify our training sessions and our pre-season schedules, obviously because our season changed. And we're currently running into straight, starting last week at our first match. This week is like a Springbok trials back in the day down in Cape Town. Newlands is the last day that Newlands ever going to be used. And then from the week after on the 8th, I think it's on the, it's not the 8th, it's Thursday, but that weekend we start our first Currie Cup match. So we needed to plan for that and obviously plan for, we've got about 12 Springboks in our side. So we needed to plan for their going off to overseas for the end of the year as well. Extreme deconditioning, I think that was one of our major issues. We obviously gave the athletes programs and plans in COVID, but when they return, we obviously need to follow strict protocols on deconditioning. What happened to the athlete, and because he didn't have a lot of time and staff, the testing of the athletes was quite important when they came back. Firstly, testing in the normal sense couldn't happen because we couldn't gym in facilities. So we needed to find innovative ways how we can test athletes and make sure. And we changed our setup that most of the stuff was on the field. So we needed to find ways to do that. Obviously, increased risk of injuries when we do start again. That was a concern, and obviously overtraining. So to make sure that when we start, that the training intensity and load and volume that we gave our athletes wasn't so high that we had recurring or overtraining injuries. So we have a data analyst who use Catapult, and we may be changing to something else, but we made sure that our loads were monitored precisely for each athlete every day in every training session to make sure that there was no overtraining. And obviously stuff that happened in COVID, and that I think we can all abide to that COVID, we ate like we normally didn't. We didn't train as much as we do. So there were obviously a lot of weight gain, a lot of fat gain, and the boys' body composition was a major challenge. Then obviously slowly interrupted progress, especially for our injured players and return to play, because that was obviously not just COVID related, it could be injury related as well. And we didn't have time. So in South Africa, the lockdown just meant that everything closed down. So we could even treat our athletes. So that was a concern when they came back. And then obviously the major concerns was our facilities and our program. There was obviously challenges in our social challenges and distancing and how will we train in the new normal. So the purpose of this was obviously compile and summarize the pertinent information to support our safe and appropriate training practices with our teams, our athletes, our clients in this unexpected transition period back to full training. The information schedule is to be applied in accordance with institution policies as well as latest local, state and federal in our guidelines, so according to the COVID rules and regulations. Like any franchise probably in South Africa, because we fall under our government and our provincial governments, so we needed to make sure that if there was a challenge, that they could come and test our facility, come and test our staff, go through our protocols and make sure that there was no issues relating to that. So where do we start? So just to say a little bit about the COVID, this was some of the protocols that we found that was applicable. So, and I'll just go through them quickly. If a lot of our athletes were obviously asymptomatic, so I mean they didn't have any symptoms, and all of them obviously needed to wait for 2 weeks before resuming training. So mild symptoms, there was in South Africa quite a variety of symptoms, around about 7 different varieties, from nose, sore throat, ears, a lot of taste buds that went away. There was obviously a lot of pain and soreness for some of the athletes that had it. Obviously there was a few other symptoms but there was a few major 7 ones that we regulated. And those athletes obviously needed a 14-day break of workout before they could return. So what we did as well is, because we've got some equipment available, we gave equipment away to those players, to their facilities and where they stayed, and gave them programs remotely, so that we had virtual training sessions that they could still train if they had mild symptoms, but obviously regulated through the doctor and our medical fraternity. And then obviously positive, severe symptoms, hospitalized. Luckily, we had no one of our immediate athletes hospitalized. But for my own brother passed away through COVID, and one of the biggest issue was heart. We had a player in our facility who actually was tested twice positive with COVID. The first time asymptomatic, had no symptoms, and the second time when he came back, he had irregular heartbeat. So for 2 weeks, we had him on a certain regime that he trained remotely from the side, but he also had equipment attached to his body to regulate his heart rate. If you look in Europe, that was one of the major issues. A lot of Europeans still struggle with that. The symptoms is sometimes, even if it's asymptomatic, meaning we can't pick it up by looking at you physically, there was still heart, brain, and lung functions that changed and was affected by COVID that we couldn't see with the naked eye. And then obviously severe symptoms, hospitalized with heart issues. These athletes, obviously, we had only one luckily on our system. They were obviously confined for 14 days, and then they slowly progressed back to our normal regime. So just important, just from a strength and conditioning point of view, getting more into specifics, are more highly athletes that had a long training base. They were in our system for many years. They're not juniors. It was obviously advised for them to check out and make sure that their hearts were in better condition. And that was something that we checked out consistently and still do. So when we started our program, all of our athletes had a cardiac test. So we had then been tested obviously for the COVID test themselves, but then they had an ECG system that we tested the heart, and was sent to cardiologists to make sure that there was no further issues relating to that. Now we obviously knowing that the cause of symptoms on the body had to practice and resumed. So we had a very slow start to our season. So slower than we normally had. We spoke about last time about our physical and psychological effects. But one of the physical effects obviously is, even if they were highly trained, we started very slowly. To make sure that there's no risks with our athletes. So one of the things we did in COVID, especially in the period, we only trained aerobically. There was very few exercise sessions that we had, that intensity was above 80% of their max, to make sure that there wasn't any physical issues. So any unusual resting heart rates or heart rates, well, obviously we were monitored. All of our athletes, we gave them watches. Actually, they purchased watches with the heart rate monitors on them to make sure that if there's any irregularities, that the doctor instantly knew about it. So their resting heart rate was monitored, and when they trained, their heart rate was monitored to make sure that there wasn't any issues. And then obviously there was excessive fatigue that we checked on their monitoring system. There was shortness of breath that was monitored. Dizziness, chest pain, muscle pains, and palpitations was quite important for us to know what the athletes went through. And like I wrote at the bottom, load testing session, gradually build yourself up to 3 to 4 weeks of period of training before we started any training. So in our schedule, we literally went for 5 weeks where our athletes trained in rows individually by themselves. There was no team training. It was all just individual themselves, making sure that all these symptoms were negative. Then minimizing the risk, okay? Managing the schedules and team training sessions. That was quite important for us, and obviously in the COVID was something that we thought was quite important for us to monitor. So group sizes were changed dramatically. So our training session, we had smaller group sizes in the beginning. We only started with 5 guys in a group, and they trained at different times. So the group in itself, like you see this picture, they had separate training. This was a group, but it wasn't us. They trained in separate rows and lanes. And we made sure, obviously, to make sure that that was part of our local and state and federal authorities. And then special consideration were made in transitional periods between the 2 groups. So when the 5 trained and they moved from one training to another group coming in, we literally trained the whole day with only 5 groups or 5 individuals coming in, and separately then a 15-minute to an hour of cleaning before the next group came in, making sure that obviously the gyms were cleaned properly before the next group came in, and also in the training field sessions, that all equipment touched, the balls, the elastic bands, the sleds, whatever was cleaned properly. Then strength conditioning coaches should always consider the training level of the athletes. There was something obviously that we looked at in our environments, because especially the younger training age groups of the athletes were quite important to know what their level were, and then how well they know their own bodies. I think that's quite important for them to know when is it normal and how is it supposed to feel. So for younger athletes, was it quite important to teach them to know their bodies well. And while in common start beginners with industry training phase, intermediate and advanced lifters possess ability to train near failure, we actually discourage them to train to failure because we were scared of the symptoms in the gym. So we made sure that they obviously train as hard as they possibly can, but the typical gym scenarios where we normally do up to failure or to your maximums, we try to keep that as low, and we look more into movement quality than we looked into in performance quality. Then considering all the preparatory and logical factors relating to training following COVID, initial weight rooms, the split should include no more than 3 training sessions per week. So if you look at training sessions per week, especially in the gym facilities, we had in our field, we had 3 training sessions on the field in the beginning, and we had 2 to 3 gym sessions during the week. And the only reason for that was obviously is to monitor recovery, because we needed to make sure that our athletes were proper recovered before they train again for the next session. Because we were scared of the symptoms of the virus, we weren't sure if the symptoms were typical like a normal athlete with delayed onset of muscle soreness and other relating recovery factors. We needed to make sure that the recovery periods of the athletes were long enough so that we can take the symptoms of COVID away for the athletes. I don't know if that makes sense to you. And maybe ask a question or 2 afterwards. And then strength conditioning coaches should use their best evidence-based and consensus-based judgment in employing other weekly program strategies, favoring shorter, more frequent training sessions while managing recovery and readiness. So we just thought obviously it's important for our judgment to take consideration that everything needs to be taken vigilantly, rather say it needs to take into consideration the training, the load, the intensity, the frequencies, the recoveries, and then obviously pertinent with that was the recovery strategies that we used. So for the first 12 weeks, we couldn't use ice bath, we couldn't use social areas where they use the same swimming pool. So we needed to adapt to recovery strategies for individuals that we could recover them properly without minimizing the effects of COVID and knowing which is which. Was it a COVID-related incident or was it just normal fatigue? So initial focus and reestablishing dynamic movement patterns was quite vital for us. So we had certain areas and blocks where we utilize and still do up to today, where we started our warm-ups with the team sessions, especially beginning was remotely at different areas, and what we call pillar prep and movement preparations were done remotely, and the individuals needed to buy their own equipment. So own mattresses, own elastic bands, own mini bands, foam rollers, foam sticks, and they separately by themselves warmed up and did their preparations for warm-up before they entered the session or the field in the gym. And then a systematic and progressive dynamic warm-up obviously followed for 10 to 20 minutes just to allocate to see if there are any symptoms that we needed to know about the athlete. And then obviously we started with, in our first few blocks, we started with energy systems, movement, sprint, and obviously range of movements patterns to make sure that the athletes are not injured or there's any other symptomatic stuff and obviously likelihood to reduce injuries. And then just lastly, to talk a little bit about facilities and equipment. So this is obviously an American picture. It's not our own gyms. I'm not allowed to show our own gym. But what we did for our facilities and gyms is we followed obviously South African guidelines and regulations. So we had stationed sanitizing stations where the athletes needed to clean their own equipment that they used. In the gym facility, typically like this one, we had blocks allocated for certain areas. So if an athlete used a certain equipment, he could only use that equipment in a certain area, and everything he used needed to stay in that area. And then one of the cleaning staff pertinent for that area or for that block first needed to clean that area, clean the staff, clean the equipment, clean themselves, and before they could move to another facility or to another training area. So we obviously in our facilities, we needed to create stations where the athlete could train. We obviously needed to get sanitizing procedures and obviously sanitizing equipment and cleaning equipment. So one of them was paper towels, spray bottles, hand sanitizers, making sure that athletes use masks, and obviously making sure that social distancing was pertinent in every training session. And we literally were like, almost like policemen. We were running around every day, making sure that the protocols were in place, and then secondly, making sure that athletes trained according to their guidelines. And then just lastly is obviously the training safety, the risk factors following periods of activity. One of our major issues were the athletes trained well for 14 weeks or so, and then they were positive in COVID. And then they needed to go in quarantine by themselves. In the beginning was 14 days, and then it lowered down to 7 days. And currently we at 7 days if you're positive, and if you're asymptomatic, it's 48 hours. That the positive test need to be a negative on the testing, and they're obviously coming back and showing that after activity that you have recovered and you have no symptoms. And then we followed a program or a protocol that we'll go through a bit later of how the athlete then returned to training and returned to play before or after the COVID. And the major issue was that the certain standard or baselines that they had before COVID, that they needed to have a minimum of those baseline requirements before they could inactively start, return to train and return to play. So the next bit, I just want to ask Vincent. So I don't want to bore you with me talking all the time. So one of the training elements that we started, obviously with the guys remotely, that we think is a great element you can add to your program if someone is inactive and he had a positive COVID test, that they could still train cognitively. So I'm just going to let Vince quickly go through a few slides with the guys and explain to you how your athlete can still train. And just a bit of the research, I think Vince will go through that even if you train cognitively, that you can still train endurance of the mind, and obviously the perceived exertion will be better. So I'm going to go away for a few minutes and give you guys the time to have a chat with Vincent. Thanks, Vince.
Hi guys, so my specialty is almost working with athletes, and I don't just do the physical training, I like to do cognitive training with them as well. And basically it's just something that I've found in my research where you can train an athlete's body to withstand fatigue. So why shouldn't you be able to train the mind to do the same? And I'm sure a lot of you will have found that when you start playing a sports game, you've got a wide attention span, and you can hear the coach shouting on the side, and you can hear the fans screaming and the players on the field shouting, and you know which of them you need to tune out and which of them you need to tune into. And the more fatigued you get as the game goes on, that attention span starts to narrow quite a bit. So I train the athletes to try and prolong that as long as possible. So let's just get into it a little bit, especially for COVID reasons. So although the body may need to rest during the initial phases of COVID-19, up to 14 days we've seen, you're still able to do brain exercises. And the reason for this is studies have shown that even if you train an athlete cognitively, it has no effect to the overall fatigue or load, to their training load. So that's a great thing. You can do it as much as the athlete is happy to do it, and they can train it as often as they want. And this will also be a great way to keep the athletes focused. So a lot of athletes, when they train all the time and they get almost an endorphin release and they love it. When they can't train because they're injured or they're sick, they start to get a bit despondent and they become upset. So this is a great way to keep your athletes busy, and it will have a crossover to their sport. So they can have peace of mind that they are still training almost. It's just a bit different. And obviously this is a great time for them to work on these small things that will make a massive difference in their performance, because they have a lot of downtime and they can't train physically when they're sick. So there are many varieties of different apps that you can get that are free to download and play. And these are all available on the App Store. You just need to type in brain training. So what is brain endurance training? As we've discussed, exercise is physical and mental. And obviously from what I've been saying, I don't know if you guys know about the central governor theory, but there's a strong link to that, in which the brain is the central governor and the brain controls everything. And even when you feel like you can't push physically, you feel like you're exhausted and you've got nothing left in the tank, the brain is what's telling you that, and you actually can push a bit further. So neuroplasticity is the change in neural pathways and behavior or environment. And this is basically what brain training is you're rewiring the neurons in your brain. So the brain engages in what's called synaptic pruning, and it deletes the old neural connections that are no longer necessary or useful and strengthens necessary new ones. So there are a couple main key areas for brain training, some of which are sustained attention. So the ability to repeatedly do a specific task over and over again. Selective attention, where you can select what you want to focus on and which aspects you want to discard from your attention in the moment. Response inhibition, which is one of the hardest ones, is do I go or don't I go? So you need to decide whether to move or not and when to move correctly. Decision making, very, very similar to that, but it relates more to the game. Vision is massive for athletes. If you can't see, you can't react. Or if you're slow to see, you're going to be slower to react, which means you lose. Cognitive flexibility This is the ability to cope with a change in your environment. So for athletes, especially professional athletes that travel a lot and go and play in different areas, different climates, against different teams, this is a big one for them. Can they adapt to the situation? Can they handle moving from playing in a small local ground to playing on a big stadium full of fans? Your working memory, the ability to remember and use relevant information while in the middle of an activity. So can you remember the plays that you went through when you're training, when you're actually playing the game? And recognition memory, being able to recognize patterns and see things on the field. So we're going to focus a bit on visual training and why it's so important. So visual deficits have been shown to have large impacts on cognitive skills, and they can impair the genetic potential of the athlete. So some guys did a study in 2015, and they found that basic sports vision drills used as an accessory to cognitive training can increase the athlete's response inhibition as well as their selective attention. So some types of VOR that we like to use, some visual training, is VOR, which is vestibular ocular reflex. So basically, can you keep your eyes fixed on a point while your head or body is in motion, which is obviously very, very important for athletes. And can you see that clearly? Then we use vision boards or vision sticks. So I'll show you vision sticks just in a sec. We use a Stroop test. I'll show you that as well. The Brock string, the eye dot, all of these are coming up, and peripheral vision, obviously. So vision sticks, here's a little video that we'll play it just to demonstrate. Okay, so here he's changing from near gaze to far gaze. They call it eye push-ups, and he's trying to track objects. There's small symbols and logos, letters, colors, numbers on these sticks. And he's just doing various exercises trying to train his vision. And these are simple things. You can make your own sticks or boards, and you can train your athletes with these. So he's doing depth perception. One eye covered, and peripheral vision. All right. Okay, and here we have an example of what's called a Stroop test. So in a Stroop test, you'll ask the person to say the color inside the word and not read the word. So you would read it from going down from left to right. You'd say red, black, yellow, blue, green. And obviously you'll try and get the athlete to do that as quickly as possible and maybe in between exercise, so they're not fully focused on that. And it gets a little bit tricky and just helps them to stay focused when they're training as well. Here's a Brock string test. So you can also make one of these, you can get them. And basically it teaches to train your eyes convergence. So what you'll do is you'll hold this up to your face, almost as the picture is showing it, and you'll try and cross your eyes so that the green bead moves and covers one of the other beads on the string. And then you try and play around and get one of the red beads to the front. And basically what it does is trains your eyes not to suppress one of your eyes. So both of your eyes will be equally strong and they'll be able to focus on objects. So even your peripheral, if you look that way and your nose is blocking your left view, your right eye will still be able to focus as well as if you were looking the opposite way. And especially if a ball is kicked overhead or something, your field of vision and your ability to focus on that object will be a lot greater. Another one, this is called an eye dart. So you can use a laser and point it at a wall and move it around, and the athlete needs to try and focus on that point. You can also have multiple lasers, all the same color, and they'll have to try and follow one moving around. So peripheral vision, if you just read this quickly, can you find the mistake? So if you didn't realize that the word "the" was written twice, then your peripheral vision may not be as sharp as you thought it was. And Dr. Cheryl Calder is a South African doctor of sports science, and she created a career for herself out of in particular visual training. And she's worked with top athletes from New Zealand, rugby players, England, the Sharks, the Springboks. So she's had a wonderful career and she's helped many, many athletes. And then some of the apps that you can download and use. Soma MPT, this is a paid app, but it's a very, very good app. They've got about 42 different drills. to help train the brain for athletes, and they can all be done on their phone, on their tablets at home. There's many other apps that are partially free or completely free on the App Store. You just need to give a quick search around brain training and similar keywords. And then the switched on training app. This app is perfect for athletes that can do a bit of movements and run around, because you can actually create your own drills. There's YouTube tutorials, there's preset drills. It's 100% free. It's on Android and iOS. And you can do functional training. So you can put your phone there and you can react to the cues that the phone gives you randomly.
Thank you. Cool, gentlemen. That was Vince. Thank you so much, Vincent. I'm learning so much from Vince every day, and I think that's one of the elements that we are missing. For many years, we thought that we couldn't study the brain. Obviously, you needed to cut the brain off in the body to study the brain. But through current science, obviously, we can know that the one is a thing that manages all our movements and our behaviors, and the others obviously is a symptomatic, something that's a somotype. So all our senses are used to gain information for the brain to make the decision. So I think BET and neurotraining is something definitely for the future. And then just to quickly wrap up, there's not going to take much longer. There's obviously when the boys were affected or athletes were affected, this guideline is aimed at athletes with mild to moderate symptoms of COVID. Athletes should follow local government guidelines, like you said, and major symptoms including isolation, test processes. Athletes who have more contained infections and requirements, obviously hospitalized, needed to follow different things. So obviously at the bottom, there was rest from onset, so 10 days, at least 7 days when they were positive, and off treatments, obviously if they didn't use any drugs, and obviously gradual return to training. It's important, obviously, what we have done also, like I said, on our app, all of these symptoms are symptoms that we daily monitor for our athletes. And obviously, if there are symptoms, they get quarantined and isolated very soon. As soon as they are symptomatic, then they will follow protocol to see the doctor. There will be a test or COVID test being done on them. There will be an ECG test being done on them, and obviously respiratory tests will include in there. And then obviously when there are a negative test, then obviously there will be a certain return to protocol to be followed. If they are positive, obviously they'll go into quarantine and they go into isolation for a minimum, again, like I said, 10 or 7 days, depending on the new symptoms. And then just self-assessment, it's something I thought you guys you can go and adapt it by a bit. It's just a cardiac investigation, referral for all regular exercise and amateur athletes prior to return. I'll share this slide with George, the slideshow, and you guys can obviously go through it. But just either to say that, are you in green, gradual return to training? Are there considered discussion with cardiologists or interest in sport cardiology and ECGs that you need to go through? And obviously you have symptoms, you are hospitalized, there are lung functions, and obviously you need to be referred to a cardiologist or a pulmonologist to make sure that you are ready and willing and able to return to training. And then just to quickly give a feedback of what we do in our functional training, how we get our athletes to get back. Obviously, there's a period of no activity. We start with light exercises. This is a football model, so football-specific exercises will be given in. This will be in rows without a team. You do it individually by yourself, and then obviously there's running skills, start progressive anaerobic drills, and then obviously will be slow contact or contact skills. And then there's non-contact, obviously complex training where there's certain elements of the skill set that has returned. So what we did there is we used units. So if there was backline and for us and forwards, or even smaller parts of tight 5, locks, loosies, inside backs and outside backs, they will fall into that category. Then they train with that relative groups. Just on that set is what we did is we made sure in our groups that if we had a case, and that's currently our case, if we had a case where in our groups of 14 or 15 in the side that we're currently at, and there is a positive case, obviously that would have meant that everyone needed to be isolated for 14 days. So we made sure that both our teams were strong enough that if there was a positive case and we needed to isolate or quarantine those elements of players, that we at least had another team available to play if it's necessary. And then obviously we had to return to training. Following medical clearances, the athlete could return like a normal athlete to train like they normally do. And then obviously we are now literally this last week and following weeks we are returning to play. That means we are in full training again. We started scrumming literally 15 on 15 or 8 on 8 about 2 weeks ago. We did individual scrums before, and we are actually in full contact and playing from the last 2 weeks. Then just a description of a variety. Like I said, there's a lot of information you can get on the internet. But there's stages of progression that the athletes can go through, a gradual protocol for you to follow. And like I said in the beginning, just to look at heart rate and the beginning of walking and inactivity to resume normal training and progression. I think it's important that you sit down with your S&C coaches or you as a coach go through the critical protocol necessary to make sure that your athletes are ready and without symptoms back when they start to train. Because there's obviously a lot of things that need to be covered, and if it's not covered, it means you start from afresh again. And like nothing else in this world, we're at that stage where we'd rather be overcautious and overemphasize of what the athlete needs to do than thinking it's not there. We're all aware that the virus is still there. In South Africa, it's still growing. So we are very conscious and very pertinent to make sure that our protocols are followed to the letter. And then just references at the back, obviously you can go through that by yourselves. Okay, cool. So that's us. Just want to stop the share. Okay, George, that's us. I don't know if there's maybe some questions that someone would like to ask.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pieter and Vincent. I hope you can hear me clearly. We are waiting for guys to ask any question, but I believe Mr. Kwambo can tell us, our mediator, anything, if anything has been asked from the Facebook Live page. So Kwambo, anything? Mike Kwambo?
Don't see Mike here.
Oh, he's here, he's here.
Is he here?
Anything?
Hi, Pieter. Well, no questions as such. Just want to appreciate our viewers watching in from Uganda. They are interested in cognitive training. So maybe if you can expound a little bit more about cognitive training.
Cool. So obviously there's a few things that we can discuss, and obviously what we add there, what Vince has set up for us, is there's certain stages and phases that you go through. So there's 4 phases of cognitive training that you can go through and obviously implement. So what we can arrange, George, is maybe a day that we come back and explain to you maybe how we follow the certain stages and phases and how it moves from just individual standing based training to how do I train cognition on the field? How can I implement it into my training on the field to get the best benefit for my athletes and obviously train it from there?
Yes, we can organize for that, and we come back on a Friday evening like this one, and we just deal with cognitive training. So I hope so guys on Facebook have heard that. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Any questions, gentlemen?
Pieter, just one question.
Yes, Mike.
I don't know if you can hear me. My question is just to seek your experience from the Sharks. Like, how long did it take you from the time that you guys started training to actually start contact training? And did you break that into start with the 5 groups to the 8 before you go into all the whole team? Is that what you did, or How do you?
Yeah, that's exactly what we did. We started in groups of 5, but because obviously we needed to follow social distancing, those 5 athletes were still training individually on themselves in a row or in a gym. They had isolated areas where they had their own gym available. They were still training in a group, but they were obviously social distance. And then if they trained, whatever they used, they trained it, they left it there. We had a cleaning team come in, and that groups of 5 changed to 8 to 15. And currently, for the first about 2 weeks ago, we're training in full training session. But to say that, Mike, that took us 19 weeks. So most people and schools and athletes don't have 19 weeks, but we are vigilant to say that we knew that if we had one positive case and spread, and we had 15 on 15, and it was positive, it meant we didn't have a side to train with. So we rather took caution to train in smaller groups individually, social distancing, and make sure that if there's a positive case, that the other ones weren't affected. Because that's a major issue, especially because it spread through the mouth and touch. So we needed to make sure that one thing we did from the start was obviously in any facility, a gym facility, there was always a mask and social distancing, and that rule is still applied till today, Mike. They still wear a mask, they still not allowed to train, and everything that they touch, they need to clean themselves, and then the team clean, or the clean team comes in and they clean everything. We defog it every week to make sure that the air inside the facility is also clean. And then obviously on the field, we have a cleaning team that if the next cycle of players came through, that everything they touched, the balls, the equipment, the shields, whatever, that was also cleaned before.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, we have a question from Charles Ngovi. He says, I may have missed it, but before calling the players in, how many COVID tests did you carry out on each player? And how many are you doing since they came in?
Okay. So Charles, before the lockdown, obviously lockdown in South Africa happened so quickly. We were training, we had a period of time that we all started to know in March, I think I remember March, that there was COVID. And then when lockdown happened, when South Africa, we're not allowed to go anywhere. It was literally locked down. People weren't allowed to go outside their homes. So we only started, so to answer the first question is, we only started team testing when the boys returned. If there were any symptomatic athletes during COVID, we needed to follow the government regulations. They were sent to, we had certain spots in South Africa where you should go. You weren't allowed to go to a medical doctor. You were supposed to go to these allocated areas in South Africa. There, the testing protocol would have happened. And it was all remote. It was all individualized. We only asked the players that if they had symptoms that we knew about it, because we needed to monitor their progress. And then we followed the progress while it was the lockdown. And after lockdown, we started, Charles, with testing them once a week. So we tested in the beginning was Tuesdays or Mondays because they had a training week, and everyone then from the Monday who was a positive obviously was quarantined and followed the protocol. Currently, we use a different company. So in the beginning, we all were nose and nostril tests. I don't know if you've done the test. So that was nostril testing. Currently, we in a research in South Africa through Harvard that they actually do mouth swabs and spit. So our current test we employing it to test every day because of the gradual increase in South Africa, but that's only saliva testing. So they're seeing how the effectiveness is to monitor it in saliva and not just nostril, because a nostril in South Africa is very expensive, about 1,000 Rand a test. So you can imagine testing 64 players. And then I haven't said that, but our junior players, that's another group of 46 players. And we were down 19, so 16 weeks prior, the 3 weeks in when we started train, our junior train started as well, our under 21. They started their competition tomorrow. They also returned, so it meant we needed to test the seniors and the juniors all collectively. That's over 120 players to be tested a week. And financially, you can imagine, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's the same areas.
So we did only one test a week, and currently with the saliva, it's a lot cheaper. We do try and test every day. I hope that answers your question, Charles.
Yes, it does. It does. Thanks very much for that insight.
Pleasure. Any other questions, gentlemen?
There's a question pending from someone with an iPhone. How and where do you learn how to train the cognitive aspect of training? Then they go ahead and say it would be nice if we have a full session on this. Otherwise, very good session from the two of you.
Cool. We will definitely have a second session. So my fascination with where I got Vince involved with cognitive training started. I'm currently doing a study on the response of breathing. So how does how can you switch the brain on and off? So Vince worked, he joined me like 2 years ago. Yeah. 2 years ago, and he started as an intern with me, and then I put him on this path to say that how can we activate our athletes, and a lot of our S&C science currently is that pre-potential potentiation. You'll hear that if you read up of S&C, is how do we activate the body. My only concern for many years were we actively physically get the bodies warm, but we don't get the mind warm. And then we started with this journey of saying, how can we get the brain active? But more than that, how can we get the brain not active, but endure for longer? So what we've done, and if you go and look at Tim Noakes and the studies that Tim Noakes have done, we've realized that the brain is the thing that makes you tired, not the body. To give you a simple example, so you've been sitting and listening to me for about an hour, you're all tired. You haven't, and you've been sitting. Okay, so the brain making sure that you are alert needs to endure for longer periods of time. And a very simple thing, if you're running on a cool, breezy day, you can go further without getting tired. But if it's hot and it's humid, before you even start running, your body tells your brain, wow, I can't endure that long. So the brain is the thing that determines, not the body. And we need to find a way where we can train both, not just the physical, but the mental and the brain as well. And that's how the journey started. It's been about 2 years. And it's only the last year that we actually are busy on game sense. So how can we use games to train cognition so that the team has a benefit, not just the individual? Any more questions, George?
Well, no more questions. Just there's a question
from Moto.
Moto Williams. Nice presentation. He starts with a comment. Nice presentation. A quick one. Are all the players staying in camp, or are they allowed to mingle freely with the family members after a certain session, or are they put in solitude? Secondly, how viable is the idea of testing after every fortnight, especially in clubs that are struggling with finances? Lastly, how can S&C help in guiding players with mental health issues at this time? Thanks.
Okay. So just, George, Mike must help you with the first question. So the first question is, and the answer is, in the beginning, our junior players were in one group because they normally, they don't have family and friends and wives and kids. So we keep them isolated in a camp. But the senior players obviously are married with family, so we needed to find a way to keep them isolated. And we obviously asked, it wasn't something we could drive, that they don't go to social gatherings, don't go anywhere with family, even in those bad cases that if there was even a funeral that you would attend remotely via Zoom or phone, that you didn't attend those funerals and or the bigger gatherings. The second question, sorry, Mike, was, what did you ask there? Sorry, I can't remember.
How viable is the idea of testing after every fortnight, especially in clubs that are struggling with finances?
Okay, I think that was the third question, but just to say that I do understand in our environment, it's special because we work with players that we pay a lot of money to keep in. My co-question would be, Mike, or I think Moto asked it, is it worthwhile not testing? Because if you do not test and you get one player who is sick, and it spreads it to the rest of your team, it means that one individual could cost the life of the rest of your team. And that's a sad thing about COVID. It's not a game. It's not a funny thing or a remote thing that only certain people get. Anybody can get it. And we, until now, with science, can't tell you how symptomatic you will get. You can get someone who has a small cough, and you have someone with the same virus who might die because they can't breathe. So the counterbalance, Marta, I'll ask is it worth it not to test? And I think you need to test. And you need to test as many times as you possibly can. Because very simple, just explain, I can be negative in COVID today, negative. And I meet someone today, just meet and stay with them in 15 minutes. And then after that, I'm positive. It means tomorrow I'm positive and I can, besides just get the virus, I can spread the virus. So I think testing is vital, and as many times as you can, the safer you will be and the safer your players and your staff will be. And the third question, Mike, is sorry, what was the third question?
How can strength and conditioning help in guiding players with mental health issues at this time?
Okay, so in our lockdown period, what we did is I'm a facilitator for a course, what they call 3D coaching. So we believe strongly that obviously the first dimension that you coach in is physical, all that other stuff, but mental coaching and mental health is vital. So I did a facilitator's course that we currently implement with all our national coaches, amateur coaches, and school coaches in South Africa that follow, and we can present this coach. It's a 14-week cycle of how we can coach your coaches, how to train mental fitness or mental health and mental well-being, like cohesion and team and motivation. And the third dimension is how do we train the athlete specifically in how do we coach their hearts, how do we coach purpose, how do we coach legacy, more the intrinsic stuff of the brain and how we can help in that form.
Okay, and just a reminder to everybody watching, this session is being recorded live on Facebook. It will be available immediately after. We'll also upload it on the Kenya Rugby Union YouTube page. We have a question from Charles Ngovi. For the vision tests, is there any evidence or possibility that persons with impaired sight will gain some benefits?
Yeah, there are some research. Vince will probably tell you on that day that it has. Obviously, the first thing would be is if there is any element of visual impairment, they need to go and see an optometrist. They need to go and see someone who specializes in eye care. What we're training is not eye care. We are training visual skills that can help you, assist you in performance. And that performance, obviously athletic performance. Can you catch a ball? Can you see peripherally? Can you anticipate? Can you focus for longer? Can you endure for longer? It is not stuff with visual impairment. I think if there is any issues, and you maybe might see it, then the first thing is maybe go to optometrist or go to an eye doctor, make sure that they test you to see if your vision is. This is not what we do. This is not to do with visual or cognitive training. It's something different. I hope that answers your question, Moto. Or was it Charles? I can't remember Charles.
They both asked questions, Moto and Charles. So I think you've answered them well.
Yeah.
Yes, well answered. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question, gentlemen?
None so far.
It seems to me that the information was maybe above your head, especially about the COVID things. There's so many things and there's so many information. But my honest praise or prayer for you guys is carefully go through it. There's so many stuff on internet that you can find. You can use this presentation, go through them step by step, make sure that your athletes and you are safe before you resume training, or if you do train, make sure that the protocols are in place to keep you and your athletes safe. And again, I can't stipulate it more. It's not a joke. It is very serious.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah. So,
any questions, General?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Vincent, and thank you everyone else who joined in. We are glad that this was an eye-opener, and for sure, for those listening in, I'll engage Peter again and Vincent and see if we can get a cognitive session like this one. So asanteni sana. And Peter, there are some people asking for your email address, which I'll send just to engage you on a matter, and we keep moving. Asante sana, Peter.
Thank you very much.
100%. Love to see you again, and blessings, and please be safe.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
that was
thank you.
That was good.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Have a blessed day.
Be safe,
Cheers,
and,
gentlemen.
Thank you. Cheers.
thank you,
Cheers.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.